June 6, 1944. German MG-42 gunners watched their impenetrable concrete bunkers, 6 feet thick, designed by Rommel himself, explode into dust from a single shot fired by a strange British tank they'd never seen before. Within hours, elite Wehrmacht positions that were supposed to hold for weeks were simply erased, turned into clouds of pulverized concrete and twisted steel by 40-pound explosives launched from squat, ugly vehicles the Allies mass-produced like candy. How did Germany's most confident defenders go from laughing at the first wave to realizing in absolute horror that the British had built an entire army of specialized machines for the sole purpose of making their fortress doctrine completely obsolete? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. June 6, 1944. The sun rose over the beaches of Normandy, France, painting the concrete bunkers in soft orange light. Inside one of these fortresses, Obergefreiter Hans Müller adjusted his MG-42 machine gun and smiled. He had every reason to feel confident. The bunker around him had walls 6 feet thick, made of reinforced concrete that could stop any shell the Allies might fire. Small windows, called firing slits, gave him a perfect view of the beach below. From this position, his gun could spray 1,200 bullets every single minute across killing zones that had been measured and marked with mathematical precision. Hans was not new to war. He had survived 3 years on the Eastern Front, fighting in Russia where the cold could kill you as fast as enemy bullets. He had seen Tiger tanks burn and watched entire companies disappear in Soviet artillery storms. But here, in this concrete fortress overlooking the English Channel, he felt safer than he had in years. This was not the open steppes of Russia. This was Fortress Europe, and every meter of it had been designed by the best military minds in Germany. The bunker complex Hans defended was part of a larger strongpoint called Hillman, though the local French people had a different name for it that the Germans never bothered to learn. Months of work had gone into building these positions. Forced laborers had poured thousands of tons of concrete. Engineers had calculated exact angles of fire. Steel reinforcement bars, thick as a man's wrist, ran through every wall. The bunker had multiple rooms connected by narrow corridors. It had ammunition storage that could feed the MG-42 for days. It even had a small kitchen and sleeping areas because the designers knew the defenders might need to hold out during a long siege. Outside the main bunker, the engineers had planted thousands of mines. They had driven thick wooden posts into the beach at angles, topped with explosives, designed to rip the bottom out of any landing craft. Coils of barbed wire, some electrified, created mazes that would force attacking infantry into pre-planned kill zones. Hans had spent weeks studying these zones. He knew exactly where to aim when the enemy came. Every rock, every dip in the sand, every approach route had been memorized. The political situation in Germany made these defenses even more important. By the spring of 1944, everyone knew the Allies would invade somewhere along the French coast. Hitler had declared that this invasion must be stopped at the water's edge, thrown back into the sea with such terrible losses that the Americans and British would never try again. Propaganda Minister Goebbels told the German people that the Atlantic Wall was impregnable, that German soldiers in their concrete fortresses were worth 10 times any Allied soldier on an open beach. The social pressure to hold these positions was immense. Every German defender knew that failure meant not just military defeat, but the potential collapse of everything they had been told to believe in. Hans's unit was made up of experienced men, most of them Eastern Front veterans like himself. They were not the second-rate coastal defense troops that held some other sectors. They were considered elite, capable, and most importantly, they believed in their ability to win. Their lieutenant, a thin man from Bavaria named Steiner, had fought at Stalingrad and escaped the encirclement. He told the men that if they could survive Russia, they could survive anything the soft British and Americans might throw at them. The technological advantage seemed to belong to Germany. The MG-42 machine gun Hans operated was called Hitler's Buzzsaw because of the terrifying sound it made when firing. It could tear apart entire squads of infantry in seconds. The concrete bunkers were immune to regular tank guns. Even if the Allies brought their heaviest naval guns to bear, the bunkers were designed to survive. Tests had shown that only a direct hit from the largest battleship guns might crack these walls, and the chances of that happening were considered very small. The economic situation in Germany was getting worse by 1944, but here on the Atlantic Wall, the defenders still had everything they needed. Ammunition was plentiful. Food rations, while not luxurious, were adequate. The bunkers had been stocked for a long siege. Hans had 3,000 rounds of ammunition within arm's reach, with thousands more in the storage rooms below. He had grenades, signal flares, and even a few Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets for emergencies. Everything necessary for defense had been provided. The morning of June 6th started with distant thunder. Hans woke from a light sleep, confused because the sky had been clear the night before. Then he realized it was not thunder at all. It was naval gunfire, hundreds of ships bombarding the coast. The bunker shook slightly as shells landed nearby, but the concrete held firm. Hans and his comrades rushed to their positions. Lieutenant Steiner moved through the bunker complex, checking each fighting position, his face calm and professional. The bombardment was impressive, Hans had to admit. The entire horizon seemed to flash with light as ship after ship fired at the shore. Explosions walked across the beach and inland. Dust and smoke filled the air. For 30 minutes, the shelling continued without pause. Some of the wooden obstacles on the beach were destroyed. Some mines detonated in the bombardment. But when the shelling finally stopped and the smoke began to clear, Hans looked around his bunker and saw that nothing important had been damaged. The walls still stood, the guns still worked, the firing slits still gave perfect views of the approaches. Then the landing craft came. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Hans could not count them all. They looked like small boxes moving across the water. Hans felt his heart beat faster, but it was excitement, not fear. This was what they had trained for. This was why the bunkers existed. As the first craft reached the beach and their ramps dropped, Hans opened fire. The MG-42 roared, and he saw men fall on the beach below. Other bunkers opened fire too. The sound was deafening even inside the concrete walls. The first wave of Allied infantry was cut down with terrible efficiency. Hans's training took over. Short bursts, traverse left, traverse right, change barrel when it glows red, let the assistant gunner feed the belt. The doctrine was working exactly as planned. The killing zones were doing their job. Bodies lay scattered on the sand. Some Allied soldiers tried to take cover behind the beach obstacles, but Hans and the other gunners had anticipated this. They had practiced shooting at those exact spots for months. For perhaps an hour, maybe longer, it seemed like the German defenders were winning. The Atlantic Wall was holding. Hans allowed himself to think that maybe the propaganda was right. Maybe they really could throw the invaders back into the sea. Lieutenant Steiner moved through the bunker, calm and efficient, redirecting fire, calling out targets, managing ammunition distribution. Then Hans saw something that made him pause. Through the smoke and dust, strange shapes were moving. They were tracked vehicles, but they did not look like any tank he had seen before. They were short, boxy, and almost ugly in their design. Regular tanks had long barrels that stuck out far in front. These vehicles had short, stubby barrels that pointed upward at an angle. Hans had seen British Churchill tanks in recognition training. These looked similar, but wrong, modified in some way he did not understand. One of these strange vehicles stopped about 200 meters from Hans's bunker. It was close enough that he could see details. The turret was different from a normal tank. The barrel was enormously thick and short. Hans tried to aim his MG-42 at the vision slits, knowing that machine gun bullets could not hurt the tank's armor, but might force the crew to button up and limit their vision. The bullets sparked off the armor plate and did nothing. Then the strange vehicle fired. Hans had expected the sharp crack of a regular tank gun. Instead, there was a different sound, almost like a mortar, but deeper, more powerful. He saw something arc through the air, tumbling slowly. It looked absurdly large, like a flying trash can, spinning as it flew. For a moment, Hans's mind could not process what he was seeing. That could not be a shell. It was too big, too slow, too strange. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The projectile hit the bunker wall about 3 meters from Hans's firing position. The explosion was unlike anything he had experienced. The entire bunker rang like a bell. Dust and concrete fragments filled the air. Hans was thrown backward, his ears ringing so badly he could not hear his own screaming. When the dust settled enough to see, he looked at the wall where the projectile had hit. There was a crater in the concrete, a massive hole punched through reinforcement that was supposed to stop anything. The 6-foot-thick wall had been penetrated like paper. What made it worse was that Hans could see more of these vehicles now. Not just 1 or 2, but many of them, advancing behind the infantry, supporting them, protecting them. These were not tanks designed to fight other tanks. These were something else, something the Germans had not prepared for, had not even imagined. Hans felt a cold sensation in his stomach that had nothing to do with the concussion from the blast. For the first time since arriving at this bunker, he felt a whisper of real fear. Hans wiped concrete dust from his eyes and looked through the firing slit again. What he saw made his blood run cold. The strange vehicles were not alone. They moved in groups, each one supported by regular infantry and other specialized machines. One of the boxy tanks stopped near an anti-tank ditch that the Germans had spent weeks digging. Hans expected it to halt, forced to find another route. Instead, the vehicle carried an enormous bundle of logs on its front, held together with chains. It drove to the edge of the ditch and simply dropped the logs in, creating an instant bridge. Then it drove across its own bridge as if the obstacle had never existed. Another machine moved ahead of the group, and Hans recognized it from intelligence briefings he had ignored because they seemed impossible. It was a flail tank with a huge rotating drum mounted on the front. Heavy chains attached to the drum spun at high speed. Wherever it went, mines exploded harmlessly in front of it. The minefield that was supposed to channel attackers into kill zones was being erased, cleared as easily sweeping a floor. Hans had helped place some of those mines. Each one had been positioned carefully, recorded on maps, designed to create chaos and fear. This British machine treated them like they were nothing. Lieutenant Steiner appeared at Hans's position, his face covered in dust but still calm. He pointed at one of the strange tanks and shouted over the noise. Hans could barely hear him, but he understood the gesture. Steiner wanted him to fire at the vehicle's tracks, try to disable it. Hans redirected his MG-42 and sent a long burst at the nearest machine. The bullets sparked and ricocheted off the armor. Even the tracks were protected by armored skirts. His 1,200 rounds per minute might as well have been raindrops hitting steel. The vehicle did not even slow down. The machine that had hit their bunker was reloading. Hans could see the crew working through the open hatch. It took them about 3 minutes to load another of those massive projectiles. 3 minutes felt like forever, but it also felt like no time at all. Hans knew that when they finished reloading, they would fire again, and again, and again. How many of these vehicles did the British have? As he watched, he counted 6 of them just in his field of view. Behind them, more were coming ashore. The beach that was supposed to be a killing ground was becoming a parking lot for British armor. A runner came through the bunker, a young soldier who looked terrified. He brought a message from the command post. The words were simple but devastating. The British had landed dozens of these specialized vehicles across the entire invasion sector. Every bunker complex was facing the same problem. The vehicles were called AVREs, the runner said, Armored Vehicle Royal Engineers. They were designed specifically for this job, built in British factories for the sole purpose of destroying German fortifications. Each one cost a fortune, the runner had heard, maybe 15,000 pounds. Hans tried to imagine a military that could afford to build hundreds of machines for just one task, machines that might only be used for a few hours. The waste seemed incredible, but here they were, turning that wealth into German casualties. The AVRE that had hit their bunker fired again. This time, the projectile struck a different part of the fortification, widening the breach. Hans felt the explosion through his boots, through his bones. Concrete that had taken dozens of workers weeks to pour was being reduced to rubble in minutes. The bunker had backup positions, alternate firing points, all connected by corridors. But Hans understood now that it did not matter. The British would simply demolish each position in turn, methodically, patiently, with industrial efficiency. Through the smoke, Hans saw British infantry advancing behind the AVREs. This was combined arms warfare, every piece supporting every other piece. When German defenders in a bunker fired at the infantry, they exposed themselves to return fire from the tanks. When they tried to hide from the tanks, British infantry would work closer with grenades and flamethrowers. And always, the AVREs were there, ready to fire their massive projectiles at any strong point that resisted too long. Hans remembered his time in Russia, remembered the endless Soviet attacks, waves of men coming forward regardless of losses. This was different. The British were not throwing away lives. They were using machines to save their soldiers, spending money instead of blood. Each AVRE represented a choice, a decision by British society that their young men were valuable enough to protect with expensive specialized equipment. Germany had built concrete bunkers with slave labor, but Britain had built custom weapons in free factories, staffed by workers who went home at night to their families. Another message came through the bunker network. A position 200 meters to the north had fallen. The AVRE had demolished the main firing point. Then British engineers had moved in with explosives and flamethrowers to clear out the survivors. The defenders had held for 90 minutes, which seemed like a victory, until Hans realized that the British had simply moved to the next bunker on their list. They were not in a hurry. They had the resources to reduce each position properly, safely, with minimal casualties to themselves. Hans looked at his MG-42, the weapon he had trusted, the gun that was supposed to make him worth 10 enemy soldiers. Against infantry in the open, it was devastating. Against 4 inches of armor plate moving steadily toward his position, it was useless. The entire German defensive doctrine was based on the idea that concrete and machine guns could stop any attack. But the British had brought an answer to that doctrine, a mechanical solution to every problem. They had mine-clearing tanks for the mines, bridge-laying tanks for the ditches, and AVREs for the bunkers. It was like they had studied German defenses and built a toolkit specifically designed to dismantle them, piece by piece.
The AVR fired a third time. Part of the bunker roof collapsed, letting in sunlight and smoke. Hans could hear Lieutenant Steiner shouting orders, trying to organize a fighting retreat to the secondary positions. But Hans knew it was over. The British did not need to hurry. They did not need to take risks. They would just keep firing those 40-pound projectiles until the bunker was dust and the defenders were dead or surrendered. Mathematics had replaced courage as the deciding factor in this battle, and the numbers were not in Germany's favor. The moment everything changed for Hans came 6 hours into the battle. The bunker complex was still holding, barely, but every man inside knew they were living on borrowed time. Lieutenant Steiner had gathered the remaining defenders in the deepest part of the fortification, a command room that was supposed to be the safest spot in the entire complex. 23 men sat or stood in that room, covered in concrete dust, their faces blackened by smoke, their eyes showing the hollow look of soldiers who understood they were beaten but did not know how to stop fighting. Steiner had a map spread on the table, marked with positions of other German strongpoints along the coast. He kept trying to raise them on the radio, but most did not answer anymore. The ones that did answer reported the same story. AVRs were systematically destroying every bunker, every pillbox, every fortified position. Some places had held longer than others, but the ending was always the same. The British would bring up more AVRs, fire more of those massive projectiles, and eventually the concrete would crumble and the defenders would have to choose between death and surrender. Hans watched as another AVR positioned itself outside. Through a crack in the wall, he could see British engineers measuring distances, calculating angles. They were not angry or rushed. They worked with the calm efficiency of men doing a job they had trained for, a job they knew how to do well. One engineer pointed at a specific spot on the bunker wall. Another made notes on a clipboard. Then they moved away, and the AVR fired. The explosion was so close that Hans felt his teeth rattle. More concrete fell from the ceiling. The electric lights flickered and went out, leaving only the pale sunlight coming through the cracks and holes. That was when Hans truly understood what had happened. The British had not just brought better weapons. They had brought a completely different way of thinking about war. Germany had built these bunkers based on the idea that willpower and courage could overcome any obstacle. The propaganda had told them that German soldiers were superior, that their fighting spirit made them unbeatable, that the decadent democracies of Britain and America could never match German determination. But the AVR told a different story. It said that a society wealthy enough and organized enough could build custom solutions to every military problem. It said that protecting your own soldiers' lives was more important than proving how brave they were. Hans had believed the propaganda. He had believed that the Americans were soft shopkeepers who would break at the first sign of real fighting. He had believed the British were exhausted after 5 years of war, hanging on only because of American money. But a nation of shopkeepers does not build 700 specialized bunker-destroying tanks just for one invasion. An exhausted country does not have the industrial capacity to produce custom weapons for every challenge. Everything Hans had been told was backwards. The real strength was not in concrete and machine guns. The real strength was in factories that could turn out these machines, in engineers who could design them, in a society free enough and rich enough to solve problems instead of just enduring them. Lieutenant Steiner made the decision at 1400 hours, 2 in the afternoon. They had been fighting for 8 hours. Ammunition was running low. Parts of the bunker were on fire. The walls that remained standing were cracked and unstable. More importantly, there was no hope of relief. No German counterattack was coming. No secret weapon was going to save them. Steiner gathered the men and told them they would surrender. Some of the younger soldiers looked relieved. Some of the older ones looked ashamed. Hans felt nothing at all, just a strange emptiness where his certainty used to be. They emerged from the bunker with their hands raised, blinking in the afternoon sunlight. British soldiers were everywhere, moving with purpose but without cruelty. A medical orderly immediately started treating wounded Germans, using the same care he would give his own men. Hans watched this and felt another piece of his worldview crack. The enemy was supposed to be vengeful, angry, brutal. Instead, they were professional and almost kind. A British officer who spoke some German told them they would be taken to a prison camp in England, that they would be fed and housed according to the Geneva Convention, that the war was over for them. Hans looked back at the bunker as they were led away. It was barely recognizable. The walls were cratered and broken. The roof had collapsed in several places. What had seemed impregnable that morning was now just rubble and dust. He thought about the months of work that had gone into it, the confidence they had felt behind those thick walls, the certainty that they could hold forever. One AVR had reduced all of that to nothing in a few hours. Not even a whole day, just a few hours of systematic, patient demolition. On the march to the beach where prisoners were being collected, Hans passed more AVRs. They were parked now, their crews resting, eating, smoking cigarettes. The machines looked ugly and brutal up close, covered in mud and concrete dust, scorched by explosions. But they had done their job. They had protected British soldiers by destroying German positions from a distance. Hans realized that each AVR represented a value judgment. Britain had looked at the problem of fortified bunkers and decided that British lives were worth more than the cost of building these machines. Germany had looked at the same problem and decided to put soldiers in concrete boxes and tell them to die bravely. Hans sat on the beach with the other prisoners, waiting for the boat that would take them to England. He watched more AVRs coming ashore, more specialized equipment, more evidence of industrial might being applied with precision. A British soldier gave him a cigarette. Hans smoked it slowly and thought about everything he had believed that morning. He had thought courage would be enough. He had thought willpower could stop tanks. He had thought the propaganda about German superiority was true. Now he sat on the sand as a prisoner, and the bunker he had trusted was dust, and the war he thought Germany could win was clearly lost. It had been lost before the first shot was fired, lost in the factories and design offices where Britain built solutions while Germany built excuses.
The train crossed into Germany in early January 1946, more than a year and a half after Hans had surrendered on that beach in Normandy. He pressed his face against the cold window and watched his homeland pass by. What he saw made his stomach twist. Every city they passed through was damaged or destroyed. Hamburg looked like someone had taken a hammer to it. The train station in Hanover was a skeleton of twisted metal. Factory buildings stood without roofs, their walls blackened by fire. Entire neighborhoods were just rubble, carefully organized into piles by work crews, but rubble nonetheless. Hans carried very little with him. The British had given each returning prisoner a small bag with some basic supplies, a bit of food for the journey, and papers showing they had been properly discharged from the prison camp. But Hans also carried things the British had not given him. He had a newspaper clipping showing a photograph of an AVRE production line, rows and rows of these machines being built in a factory that looked clean and well lit. He had copied down numbers from lectures the British had given about industrial production, numbers that seemed impossible but that he now believed were true. And he carried memories that weighed more than any physical object. The prison camp in England had been nothing like Hans expected. He had expected cruelty, starvation, perhaps beatings. Instead, he found boredom, adequate food, and a slow routine of work details and education classes. The British had made the German prisoners attend lectures about democracy, about free markets, and about how societies organized themselves. At first, Hans had ignored these lectures, thinking they were just propaganda. But over months, he had started to listen. Not because the lectures convinced him, but because the prison camp itself was proof that everything they said was true. The camp had been boring, yes, but it had also been well run. Food arrived on schedule. Medical care was available. The guards were usually fair, sometimes even friendly. The whole operation ran with a smooth efficiency that reminded Hans of the AVREs on D-Day. This was what an organized, wealthy society looked like from the inside. It took care of details. It had systems that worked. It did not need to beat prisoners or starve them because it had the resources to do things properly. Germany had told its soldiers that the enemy was weak and disorganized, but Hans had lived inside their system for 18 months and had seen only strength and order. The train finally reached Hans's hometown in Bavaria just after dark. He walked through streets he had known since childhood, and it was like walking through a nightmare. The buildings he remembered were gone. The bakery where his mother had bought bread was a pile of bricks. The town square had a huge crater in the center from a bomb. Only about half the houses on his street still stood, and most of those had damage. His family's house had survived, barely. The roof had been patched with mismatched tiles. Several windows were boarded up. But it was still there, and when he knocked on the door, his mother opened it and wept. His father sat at the kitchen table, looking much older than Hans remembered. His sister was there too, thin and tired, with 2 small children Hans had never met. They had been born during the war while Hans was away. The family gathered around him, asking questions, wanting to know everything. His mother had made soup from vegetables she had grown in the garden, stretching it with water to feed everyone. It was thin and barely warm, but she served it like it was a feast. Hans looked at the small portions in each bowl and remembered the prison camp where meals had been plain but adequate, where there had always been enough. His father asked the question Hans had been dreading. How did we lose? The old man still had his pride, still wanted to believe that Germany had been betrayed or overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Hans looked around the table at his hungry family in their damaged house, in their ruined town, and decided to tell them the truth. He told them about the AVREs, about machines built for one specific purpose, about British engineers calmly destroying bunkers while keeping their own soldiers safe. He told them about seeing more of these specialized vehicles than he could count, about realizing that the British had so much industrial capacity they could afford to build custom weapons for every problem. His sister didn't understand at first. She asked how many of these AVREs had attacked his bunker. Hans explained that it was not about how many attacked him, it was about how many existed in total. 700, he said, built just for the invasion. His sister's face went pale. 700 machines, each one costing as much as a house, built to be used for maybe one day of fighting. What kind of country could afford that? Hans told her the answer. A country that valued its soldiers' lives enough to spend money protecting them. A country with factories that could produce anything they needed. A country that solved problems instead of just telling people to be brave and die. His father got angry at this. He said Hans was talking like a traitor, that German soldiers had been brave, that courage should have been enough. Hans felt his own anger rising. He pulled out the newspaper clipping of the AVRE production line and put it on the table. He told his father to look at it, really look at it. Those machines were built in factories by workers who had enough to eat, who went home to houses that still had roofs, who lived in a society organized enough to design custom weapons and wealthy enough to build them. Germany had used slave labor to pour concrete and then told soldiers to die in those concrete boxes. Britain had used free workers to build machines that would bring their soldiers home alive. The room was silent for a long moment. Hans's mother broke the quiet by asking what he would do now. Hans said he wanted to study engineering. He wanted to learn how to build things, not destroy them. He wanted to understand how societies created the kind of wealth that could afford compassion, that could afford to value human life more than propaganda about courage. His father shook his head, but his mother touched Hans's hand and said she thought that was a good idea.
Over the following weeks, Hans walked through his town and saw the contrast everywhere. Germany had spent everything on the war and lost. The rubble, the hunger, the damaged buildings, they were all proof that the Nazi way had failed completely. Britain had spent money on machines and won. Their cities were damaged too, Hans knew that, but they had not been invaded and occupied. Their factories were still running. Their people, while tired, were not starving. The country that built AVRs was moving forward. The country that built concrete tombs was digging itself out of ruins. Hans began attending evening classes in mathematics and basic engineering. The teacher was an old professor who had opposed the Nazis quietly and survived by keeping his head down. Hans told him about the AVRs one night after class. The professor nodded slowly and said something Hans never forgot. He said that the AVR was Britain's way of saying, "We value our young men enough to spend £15,000 protecting them." Germany had said, "We value victory enough to sacrifice our young men for it." Which country, the professor asked, actually loved its people more? Years passed. Hans finished his studies and became a civil engineer, helping to rebuild the shattered cities. He married his sister's friend, a woman who had lost her first husband in Russia. They had children, and Hans taught them very different lessons than he had learned as a young man. He taught them that strength came from building, not destroying. That a wealthy society was one that could afford to solve problems creatively. That protecting life was more important than proving bravery. That the machines that won wars were built in free factories by people who believed they were building a better future, not a glorious death. Sometimes Hans would see photographs in newspapers of military equipment being displayed in museums. Once, he saw a picture of a Churchill AVR, preserved and restored, with British children climbing on it. He stared at that photograph for a long time. The machine that had destroyed his bunker, that had shattered his certainty, that had taught him the truth about power and society, was now a playground toy. Children who would never know war played on a weapon that had helped end one. Hans thought that was exactly right, exactly as it should be. He kept the newspaper clipping from the prison camp in a drawer, and sometimes he would take it out and look at the AVR production line. He never showed it to many people, but when his son asked about the war, Hans gave him the clipping and told him the whole story. He told him about the concrete bunker that seemed impregnable, about the machine that turned it to dust in hours, about learning that industrial societies that valued problem-solving over propaganda would always win in the end. His son asked what the most important lesson was. Hans thought for a moment and then said this: "When you see a society that builds complex machines to save lives, you are seeing a society that has already won, whether they know it yet or not. We built fortresses and told young men to die in them. They built solutions and brought their young men home." That was the whole war in one sentence. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.